class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be recapping the 2024 World Juniors for the San Jose Sharks prospects. In years past, this tournament hasn't been particularly interesting for any Sharks fans, usually because the team was so good that they never actually sent any real and solid prospects to it. Maybe they'd have like one or two guys here or there, but they were never really big names, not super competitive, and so it was a tournament that got mostly ignored by most Sharks fans. These days, though, with how bad the team has been and as such how high they have drafted in recent entry drafts, suddenly this is like our playoffs of the season, since of course the Sharks will not be making the actual NHL playoffs. And the team managed to send 6 prospects to this tournament, which I believe is tied for the most amongst NHL teams. And let us immediately start off here with Will Smith, where the expectations were obviously exceptionally high, coming off as the 4th overall from this past year's draft behind players who are already making a name for themselves at the NHL level like Connor Bedard, Adam Fantilli, and Leo Carlsson. Will Smith has been doing pretty decently in his first NCAA season, is amongst the top in terms of freshman scoring, but from the immense expectations on him, he has definitely been slightly disappointing. He wasn't expected to be amongst the top in terms of freshman scoring. He was expected to be the number one guy, or at least like in that top 2, which he frankly just isn't at this point. But coming into the World Juniors, there was an opportunity on the world stage to really show himself up as a very, very exciting prospect for the San Jose Sharks and just generally around the league. Outside of Macklin Celebrini, who is expected to be the first overall pick at this year's entry draft, Will Smith was probably the number one guy, the number one best prospect to watch, at least in terms of expectations of what they might become in their NHL career. And through the group stage, things weren't all that great for Smith. He only put up 3 points in the 4 games, and this includes games against weaker teams like Norway or Switzerland. And there were conversations about whether or not Smith really was all that great. There were even conversations, since he was playing with his as-per-usual line mates of Gabe Perreault and Ryan Leonard, of whether or not Will Smith was even the best player on that line, even though he was drafted higher than both of those players at this past draft. So for those first 4 games, it was definitely a very real underperformance for him. Had he been just like some random second rounder, sure, you'd be relatively satisfied, but as a 4th overall pick, even though this isn't his just draft plus 1 year, while most of the other players at the World Juniors are in their draft plus 2 years as 19-year-olds, Will Smith is only 18, it was still definitely slightly disappointing to watch for sure, if not actually quite disappointing. Going into the knockout rounds is where people were hoping that Will Smith would manage to turn it around, and the quarterfinal games did give some signs of life from him. While it wasn't an outstanding quarterfinals appearance, it was still a very good game for Smith. 1 goal, 1 assist, 2 points there. His first multi-point game of the tournament gets him to that point per game pace of 5 games, 5 points. And it was something to be able to build upon heading into the final 2 games of the tourney. This would see the United States play against Finland in the semifinals, and then eventually, after defeating them, Sweden in the finals. 2 really strong defensive teams as well. So it was always going to be a bit of a difficulty for Smith to actually make that much of an impact, especially when you consider he, as that 18-year-old, was kind of forced to wait his turn, so to speak, behind a lot of the players playing in their final World Juniors opportunity. And so he only got about 14.5 minutes per night of ice time as a sort of third liner / second liner. So there weren't tons and tons of opportunities to make an impact. But at the semifinals and finals level, that's where he really showed up and asserted himself as one of the best prospects currently outside of the NHL. Against Finland, he would have a nice pass to Jimmy Snuggerud, which allows the US, after a weak first period, to cut that lead in half at 2-1, and then he would also score the only even strength goal for the United States in that semifinals game against Finland, with some the ability to find that open ice to set himself up for that pass from Gabe Perreault to bury that one to tie the game up at 2. So it was a really good performance in the semifinals for Smith. And in the finals, he only stepped it up even further than that, picking up 2 really nice primary assists for himself, the first of which was quite nice on a slap pass to Gabe Perreault, which I believe ended up being the first goal of the game. And generally, you could even make the argument that Will Smith was one of, if not the best forward for the United States over the last 2 games of this tournament. Obviously, other arguments could be made about players like Isaac Howard or Gabe Perreault, but Will Smith definitely in that conversation, which is in stark contrast to his very weak start to this tournament through the group stages. There were questions about his compete level, how much he really wanted to be there, and I think he really answered those questions quite well in the knockout rounds and ended up pulling up a really solid performance of 9 points in 7 games, considering just the 14.5 minutes of ice time that he would get. So the excitement, it was starting around here. It probably dropped to around here after the group stages, but now is finished all the way up here for the end of the World Juniors and heading into the rest of the NCAA season. It's a question of whether or not we might see him with the Sharks next year. It's possible he heads back to college once more, but this is definitely a good start to his development. Then we have the other player on the United States, the other player on the gold medal winning team, Eric Polkamp, defenseman, drafted by the San Jose Sharks in the 5th round. 7 games played technically with 1 goal, 2 assists for 3 points. The reason I say technically is that Polkamp, while he did dress in the last couple of games for the U.S., he basically didn't play. For instance, in the finals, he had 47 seconds of ice time in that final game, and so averaged out over the entire tourney, he only ended up with 6 goals with 6 minutes and 49 seconds of ice time played. Not particularly high, mostly as like a 7th defenseman for the United States, but 3 points during that time is really not all that bad. And the games that he did play, he looked rather solid. Not anything amazing, but pretty good. And just generally getting picked to the United States World Juniors team is an honor. Has he necessarily worked his way up the depth charts defensively for the San Jose Sharks? Perhaps not. Still likely find himself behind multiple other big names, but it was not a bad tournament. He certainly didn't hurt his stock with his performance here. Then we move on to the silver medal team. As I mentioned, the United States defeated Sweden in that final game, and the Sharks had 2 prospects on that Swedish team, Filip Bystedt and Mattias Havlin. Now let us start off with Bystedt. He came into this tournament not having the best of seasons in the SHL, but expectations were still pretty high for him heading into the World Juniors, primarily because of his World Juniors performances last season as an 18-year-old. He came into that one pretty under the radar, pretty low-key, and if not for the massive stealing of the show of Connor Bedard, who ended up over 20 points in just the 7 games that he played, Bystedt was one of the higher-performing players around the entire tournament that year. 10 points in the 7 games that he ended up playing. And so coming into this tournament as a year older in his home country of Sweden, which is where the tournament took place, it was expected that Bystedt would really lead this Swedish team to perhaps a gold medal. And while they would come close, it wasn't really because of Bystedt's performances. Game 1, he managed to put up 2 goals. He was the player of the game for Sweden, and so it was expected to be, now the dominance will only continue from here, but that was not the case. For the rest of the group stage, he put up a goal and an assist over the next 3 games, and through the elimination round, in the 3 games that he played, he had a grand total of 0 points. Just not effective at all for Team Sweden, and that doesn't necessarily bode well moving forward for Bystedt, especially when you consider his relatively underwhelming start to his SHL season this year. While his hype was at its peak at the end of last year's World Juniors, where people thought Mike Greer was an absolute genius for moving down in the draft to pick him at 27th overall, and that he might end up becoming even an effective second liner for the San Jose Sharks, I would say we're now at sort of the valley of his hype as a Sharks prospect, where now it's a question of whether or not he'd even become an effective third line forward for the San Jose Sharks. Obviously, you don't want to draw too many conclusions from just a small 7-game tournament, but it hasn't been the best of years for Filip Bystedt, and we can only hope he can get his development a bit more on track, especially if he ends up making the transition to North America next year. Likely we'll get some AHL time, and we'll kind of sort of come back to where his development is at that point. But right now, not looking great. The other Swedish player here was Mattias Havlin, and on the complete other side of the coin, Havlin had a pretty solid tournament for sure. 7 games played, 1 goal, 5 assists for 6 points. He got about 17 minutes of ice time. He was not treated as the number 1 defenseman for Sweden. That was an entirely different pairing, but he was definitely someone still relied upon to play well defensively. He had some really nice performances in those last couple of games of the semifinals as well as the finals here. Just generally pretty good. Coming into this tournament, his SHL season, not exactly given a ton of ice time, as it is the case with the SHL. It is not a development league for these teams, unlike the AHL, so where you could force like a 19-year-old to be getting a decent amount of minutes. As an SHL team, they are sort of strictly focused on trying to win games, and as you see in the NHL, these young players don't always get many minutes, and so that's kind of what happens with Halin. So he's only given, a few minutes of ice time per game. This was an opportunity for him to actually get some real reps in as a defenseman, playing against, top competition here at the World Juniors, and I thought he did a rather good job of it. It's going to be interesting to see where his position lands on the Sharks depth chart. Because he is outside of the North American sphere, it's much more difficult to really evaluate him. Obviously, he finds himself behind players like Thrun, Gavanke, Mukhamadullin, perhaps even behind players like Cagnoni and even someone like Gannon Larocque, just because he's a North American player for the San Jose Sharks. So when it comes to Halin, while he may be behind those players, one advantage that he does have is that he is more of a two-way guy. Meanwhile, a lot of the players I did mention are more offensively based. Mukhamadullin, Gavanke, Cagnoni, all very offensive players. And so if you want that sort of mixed type of two-way player, Halin, outside of like Thrun, who's likely above him, considering he's getting NHL time right now, Halin might be that next best player in line. So again, like with Bjorkstedt, it all going to depend how much he's able to adapt to North America when he eventually does come here, whether that's next year or in a couple of years or whatever it may be. But he could very well be a solid defenseman for the San Jose Sharks in a few years' time. Next, let us move on to Finland. They played in the bronze medal game, but got absolutely surprised by the Czechia team and ended up losing after they were leading with just a couple of minutes left in that third period, and they ended up losing it 8-5. So Haltunen will not get a medal for his performance here, instead coming in fourth place. But I must say, expectations, it was kind of hard to nail down what the case was for Haltunen. He's an 18-year-old coming into this tournament, so you're already knowing he's not going to be given much ice time in this game, especially not over players who are a year older than him and playing in their final World Juniors. And on top of that, Haltunen is known as a bit of a one-dimensional guy, a very good shooter, but doesn't necessarily do much else at a very high level in terms of NHL prospects. And so I was personally expecting that he'd be brought in here. He'd get maybe like 10 minutes of ice time per game max, score like a couple of points throughout the entire tournament, and it would just be a pretty forgettable performance for Haltunen, but that didn't actually end up happening. 7 games played, 3 goals, 3 assists for 6 points, which for a player who wasn't super hyped up is actually quite good. Like I mentioned with Will Smith, for a second line or a second rounder, his performance would be relatively solid, and Haltunen was a second rounder, so indeed his performance was relatively solid. The only issue with Haltunen is that all 6 of these points were actually grabbed during the group stages, so we're actually in the first 4 games of the tournament. The last 3 games, the most important one, the elimination one, Haltunen did not manage a single point in any of them, which, kind of like with Bjorkstedt, is slightly disappointing, but obviously expectations were higher for Bjorkstedt as a year older, so I would still say I'm relatively happy with how Haltunen looked. It's going to be interesting, the journey that Haltunen takes to the NHL. Like I mentioned, he's very much a strong scorer, but he doesn't exactly excel in many other areas of the game, and that doesn't necessarily exclude him from being able to make the NHL. Obviously, the most extreme example would be Alex Ovechkin, the best scorer perhaps of all time, as he sits with over 800 goals at this point in his career. Ovechkin, besides being like a physical body, doesn't necessarily do a lot else very good. He's essentially just an absolutely insane scorer, and so he becomes an effective player at the NHL level. Obviously, Haltunen will not get to the level of Ovechkin, almost certainly, but if he can be that like effective kind of 20-goal guy on the power play, he could make it to the NHL. But if you just end up with like a sort of average, middling, or even above average shot, but you're not doing the little things correctly, it's going to be hard to lock down a slot. So these next couple of years in Haltunen's development are going to be very important to see if he can really adapt to an NHL style of game, or if he'll just find himself as like an AHL journeyman who's able to score like 25 goals in a season. And then finally, we have Jake Furlong, the last player here on Team Canada, who was, probably the biggest upset of the tournament, as they lost in the quarterfinal rounds to Czechia in a surprise. Also, kind of like, I guess this was a theme for Czechia in this tournament. They got scored on in the last 11 seconds of the third period to lose that one 3-2. Furlong, so at that point, only ended up playing 5 games, 1 goal for the singular point of the tournament, with 19 minutes of ice time, meaning he was the third defenseman for Canada, which is quite good. Obviously, they had a top pairing of Lamoureux as well as Mattychuk, but Furlong right behind them, and Furlong had an effective tournament. The numbers can be slightly misleading because of the fact that Canada only played 5 games, 4 of those being group stage performances. It's definitely easier to put up solid defensive numbers when some of your games are against teams like Germany or like Norway or like whatever. But I would still say Furlong had an effective look for Team Canada, and as such for the San Jose Sharks. He looked quite solid defensively. He was honestly one of the better defensemen for Team Canada, one of the better defensemen in general through the group stages amongst all teams. His offensive game, obviously not there in terms of points, but he had some solid breakout passes of his own zone. Furlong was a player that the Sharks gave an extra long look to during the training camp of this season. Not only did he get some reps in at the rookie face-off tournament, but also a couple of reps in the preseason. And while I wasn't super impressed with him there, the fact that he was able to have a solid enough junior season to make Team Canada and perform this well does bode some hope. So like I mentioned with Havlid, as a more two-way type of guy, he does have the advantage that he's not directly competing with players like Mukhamadullin, Gavanke, and Cagnoni, and so maybe in a couple of years' time, again, like with Havlid, we could see him being able to make it to that Sharks team. But that will do it for this recap. Generally, for the San Jose Sharks, I would say things for their prospects were pretty positive. Will Smith obviously had a great finish to his tournament that does give hope that he can become a really effective player for the Sharks in the future. Both Havlid and Furlong, as well as Eric Polkamp to a lesser extent, were solid defensively for San Jose. Haltunen had a pretty decent tournament as an 18-year-old. Only really Philip Bystedt was slightly disappointing here, I would say, but all in all, quite good. Class dismissed.